All right, good afternoon. We've got another batch of questions, and these ones are for A World from Dust, chapters 7 through 9. So the third quarter of the book is what we'll be talking about. Basically, up through, we haven't gotten to humans yet, but we're getting there eventually. And so I'd like to answer these two questions. I've also got to go to class in about half an hour, so this will make sure that I'm short and to the point. Of course, use the comments to ask any more questions on YouTube. You're welcome to do that. So let's get to the first question. There was many points about figures 9.2 and 9.3 about how oxygen is so important not just to energy but also to structures. And this is one of my favorite kind of pictures that we can have. I worked with the artist Gayla Bent to make these pictures. Well, I told her my idea and she brought it to life. So let's just say that she did most of the work. But what we have right here is we have an example of oxygen and also a little bit of calcium right there about how things are held together by it. And what I like about this is that you can look at this and you can see all the O's in it. And all the O's make the basic point. You don't need organic chemistry necessarily to see oxygen is holding all these things together. If you want to get into the biochemistry, you can see more of it. This has a separate function than its major role in making fire burn and making mitochondria burn in the same way. So this shows how new ones could be made with oxygen. What I like about this one is this particular one was actually tied to the enzymes that make these changes that are shown were dated back to before eukaryotes, or actually they were before multicellular organisms. And so this is very early, and you can make the point that these enzymes and these reactions are very important, very foundational, and they can be dated exactly back to where the oxygen expanded. So the question is how this intricate and elegant system was able to be established in the first place. And that's kind of what the whole book is about. But there's an idea of water flowing through a riverbed, obeying the laws of nature. And the one reason I want to point out about this is I want you to focus on the metaphor of water here. Water is flowing downhill. The reason why I use this metaphor is precisely because of the physical chemistry in it. So the fact that these questions are coming from a physical chemistry student is really warming to my heart, because it shows me that you are seeing the main point of this, which is that if we look at these things as a ball rolling downhill or water rolling downhill, you can actually see how this connects to the energy diagrams of where you get stability and where you get instability from. And the whole thing is, if you have a big ball rolling down a hill, it's giving you some energy, and you can catch some of that energy to make a few smaller balls roll uphill. And that's exactly the idea, is that you can use water flowing through a dam to pump other water uphill. It's the same kind of metaphor, and it is really universal. It goes back to the laws of thermodynamics and how all this stuff works. So if you are fixing on this particular metaphor, you are seeing that this is the idea is that we have this intricate system where some things happen and other things don't. But you can tie the things that happen to the things that don't usually happen to make the things that don't happen happen. Okay? That's kind of philosophical, but you've got the idea right there. And so I wanted to use that as the first question because actually all the other questions can relate back to that. The other question actually goes back to chapter 7, and it talks about how the Earth's atmosphere has changed. Methane was the chemical that was first existent in the Earth's atmosphere, and I should be a little bit clarifying about this. Methane was the first energetically useful molecule that was existing. There was a lot of carbon dioxide for sure. There's a lot of other things, but the methane was the one that stuck around, number one, stuck around for a long time, and number two, could be used by life to get energy. And how did air become to be a point where we now have the current thing? We talked about oxygen coming about, but the question is, what about nitrogen? How did we come about to have 4/5 of our air being nitrogen? And really what the way that happened is a little bit of a side product. You know, the nitrogen is in the atmosphere, because N2 is a gaseous form. Once the N2 is formed, it's very hard to crack open and get energy out of it. So only a few organisms can actually pull the N2 out of the atmosphere. That means that overall we're going to have a buildup of N2, not because it's useful, but because it's very hard to break open to get any use out of it. It's because it's, I won't say useless, but it's definitely less useful. It's definitely inert when it comes to energy. So oxygen was increased by photosynthesis, putting the oxygen out, and then life built itself on that. Nitrogen is just kind of the margins. It's just kind of the gas that ends up there because nobody else can really use it that much. You have a few organisms that can crack open the N2 bond and make NH3 out of it. But that's really hard to do because it's very stable. So you just have that collecting because it's very stable. It's actually a similar reason to why carbon dioxide collects. It's just in the case of carbon dioxide, we have a lot more organisms that will pull that stable thing down and will turn it into sugar, actually making it unstable in a sense, by catching light and putting that light into making it unstable and then making it useful. Because carbon dioxide is very useful and central, nitrogen is just not as central. Now, it is connected to amino acids like you speculate here. In fact, we need some nitrogen. But we need a lot less nitrogen in living systems because of the fact that carbon is more useful and nitrogen is harder to break open. So, and you can actually talk about how the amino acids with more nitrogen in them probably came on later, especially because nitrogen is harder to use. It's just nitrogen does less. And because it does less, it ends up in the atmosphere, but it's not hurting anyone. It just keeps the air pressure up, basically. So that's why nitrogen comes about. That's why nitrogen was not around at the beginning, just because there were a lot more stable forms for nitrogen to happen. But as it collected, over time, you would expect nitrogen to collect because nobody else is really using it that much. I want to list all the gases that we can possibly have here. And I want to say that all these gases, 2 different forms of carbon, multiple different forms of nitrogen, oxygen, and water, which is a form of oxygen or hydrogen, depending on how you look at it, and then hydrogen itself. But remember, hydrogen itself will actually be eaten up, and it also will be lost to the atmosphere. So we don't need any explanation for why hydrogen is not really around. It's all the other ones that we want an explanation. And the ones that are stable here are the ones that are shown in bold. So over time you'll have a collection of the ones that are shown in bold just because they're more stable. And in fact, I want to remind you of this exact diagram that was shown in class. You see how CO2 is all the way at the bottom. It has a very stable deltaG of formation. And water, liquid, and by the way water gas is right there as well, is also very stable. That's why you get an accumulation of both of these. In the absence of other things, the ball will roll downhill. The water will flow downhill, and the atoms, the bonds, will flow until they form the most stable configuration, which in this case, CO2, H2O, and N2. Now CH4, which is methane, is shown right here, and you see that's a little more stable than the sort of neutral zero heat of formation kind of situation. But you also can see how it's stable enough to stick around, but you also can convert it, make it more stable, turn that carbon into an oxidized form, and make it roll downhill. NO2, on the other hand, is a plus 51 when it comes to heat of formation. So that actually is less stable than N2. You can do some things with it, but you aren't going to get very much energy out of it. Only microbes can use the things that are around plus or minus 50 around zero. It really takes a lot of energy to run a bigger organism. And you see how much bigger the energy is, how much lower the CO2 is than all the other things on this graph. And in fact, NH3 is all the way up there. So NH3 is an unstable molecule. It's something that you can eat and get energy out of. But it takes a lot of energy to turn N2, which is going to be zero. Remember, all elements have a zero heat of formation, or deltaG of formation. It's going to take energy to turn that N2 at zero up to an NH3 at plus 328. And I just want to encourage you, I got these out of the back of the book. I just opened my book. I have it open right here, and I got these out of it. You can get those out of it too, and I can ask a test question based on that. And then I had another question, which is, this is just great, because this is actually another form of the same kind of diagram. Again, we have more stable being down, because I like to draw things that way, because that is one of the points of the book, that water flows downhill. Except this case is not how elements flow downhill to a more stable form of the element. This is how electrons flow downhill from an electron source to an electron sink. And the way to read this document is you can imagine an electron showing up in the electron source on the left. And then it will spontaneously move if it can move downhill. So it will roll down from left to right, and it will roll downhill. The more it rolls downhill, the more energy you get from moving that electron from the source to the sink. Okay? So that's the whole point of this idea. You can imagine an electron sitting in sugar. It's in the very upper left corner of this. It's at a e value of a PE value of -8. This is just a negative log of the e value, by the way. And this is exactly what we talk about in Chapter 5. And so I love that you asked this question. And in fact, I'm going to think about how I can work this into Test 2 when we get to it. So remember this and pay attention, because I might ask you to do this on a test. The electron starts on the left, rolls down, and ends up on the right. The farther down it rolls, when you move it from the place on the left to the place on the right, then you will get more energy out of it. How do you get the most energy on this? You start off with sugar on the upper left, and you end up moving the electron to O2 on the lower right, which, by the way, makes H2O when you move that electron to it. See how that's a huge energy release to just moving the electrons. Look also about how hydrogen is pretty high up as well. Hydrogen, you can't get quite as much energy as sugar, but you can actually roll it down. If you can pass electrons from hydrogen to oxygen, you are still doing a really good job. And in fact, you can pass electrons from hydrogen to manganese or hydrogen to iron, but each of these cases you're getting a little less energy. So look at this. This helps us understand sugar to oxygen, moving electrons. That's the best way to get energy. And you can't find a better way to get energy. Now, if you can't do that, you can do other ways to get energy, but it might not be enough energy to run a multicellular organism on. It might just not be enough. So you have manganese. Manganese is actually a pretty good option. Iron is not that great of an option, but if you start with electrons on hydrogen, you can move them to iron and get some energy out of it. Because you see the distance is much less when you go from hydrogen on the left to Fe2+ on the right. So just look at it this way, and you can compare things. You can say, what if I moved electrons from H2S to manganese? And you see that I get less electrons out, but it's possible. It's possible to do that. And that's one of the reasons why I think that H2S was the original form of photosynthesis. Because you actually can get energy out of that. You can associate light with it. And then you can sort of flip it around and apply the same sort of ideas to moving light energy onto H2O. It is pretty speculative, but it makes a lot more sense than starting with H2O, I'll tell you that. And then I think this is the last question, Chapter 8. This is a biology question. What do I mean by dead genes? Is it broken from the gene structure? Does it refer to an intron? And it really does mean a broken gene structure. An intron can move around in special cases, and that could produce a dead gene. But what I'm talking about in Chapter 8 is I'm talking about just the random processes where something goes wrong in copying a gene, and then you just have a mistake, maybe even a little mistake. But if it's enough, just like you can have a big mistake if you're reading a sentence and you have a wrong letter in there, it changes the meaning of the sentence. And in most cases, there's a lot more ways for DNA to go wrong than for DNA to go right. So this leads to the second question. The question is, well, then I say that if you have more mutations when you have acid stress, couldn't that result in something good as well? Couldn't that result in the sea urchins evolving a new function, maybe to deal with the acid stress, or maybe even to gain a new function entirely? And the answer to that is absolutely. That definitely can happen. But again, because there's so many more ways for a gene to go wrong, think about how complex a protein is. And think about how easy it is if you changed 10% of the residues in the protein. How easy it would be to mess the protein up. Now, the messing the protein up can change things, and maybe it can make things better than before. But proteins are so big and so complicated that usually I can see a small change maybe making things a little better than before. In fact, that's how evolution works. But on the whole, that's a 1% chance at best. 99% of the time, you're going to have a change. It's going to be worse. It's just like if you go up and you press a random key on your keyboard in a document in your lab report that you're turning in for me. That random key might make the word better, but it's probably going to make the word worse, and it's probably going to result in a worse lab report that gets a lower grade. So I don't recommend randomly pressing letters on your keyboard. When a gene gets a mutation, it's like randomly pressing letters on a keyboard. The good news is, for a number of reasons, this actually can sometimes result in a better result, but it is unlikely. And the question is, how unlikely is it? But the question right here is, couldn't this result in a better thing? And the answer is, actually, yes, it could. But it's pretty unlikely, and for the most part, you have 99 sea urchins die, and one of them barely survives. And then one of them evolves and reproduces, and you end up with a huge benefit. But on the whole point, it takes billions of sea urchins for that to happen. And we don't want billions of sea urchins to die just because we have acid stress. We want them to live and to deal with the acid stress. So let's stop pumping CO2 out. Let's stop following that other graph where we're moving electrons to oxygen, right? And we're oxidizing the carbon in the process and producing stable CO2. It's because CO2 is so stable that, in fact, it's why it's a problem for climate change. When we run these other reactions, it results in CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's harder for the biosphere to use that CO2 than it was for it to use the carbon in other forms. So all that is, thank you for paying attention. I'm going to try to send this off to you tonight, and I will go off to my class very soon. Okay, I look forward to your last 3 chapters being read and getting questions on those by the end of this week. So I'll be looking for those students in the class.